Morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Keesa Schreane, and welcome to the Refinitiv Perspectives live stream. Since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic in the financial industry, we've seen an increase in fraudulent and illegal transactional activity. For example, in April, the Federal Trade Commission reported consumer loss of over $13.4 million. And in July, consumer loss to fraud was reported at $77 million. Now, in the advent of our virtual office environment, this has required banks and financial institutions to rethink and address the way that they traditionally have done business with prospective clients and customers. In a world where people must remain at home and indoors, institutions' doors must remain closed, the role of digital identity and its security have never been more important. Joining us for this conversation today is James Mirfin, Global Head of Digital Identity and Financial Crime Propositions at Refinitiv. We also have Deputy Chief Compliance Officer of Western Union, Bridget Abraham. Thank you both so much for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Great. Bridget, could you outline for us what have you seen in the past 3 to 4 months since the pandemic began that has really begun to change the landscape here?
So we've seen a huge shift in the way we work, the way we conduct some of our operational processes, and also the way our customers have engaged with us, right? From a traditional in-person location visit to digital online money remittances. So first and foremost, we took care of our employees, right? We had to understand that they needed to be safe and sound, and we needed them to continue to work. And so we had to move into a full business continuity plan where we had our employees across the majority of our sites begin working remotely since about mid-March. We plan to have our employees continue to work through the end of 2020 in a remote situation. And while that obviously has some downsides, we've seen some increases in productivity and some other positive trends that we've been able to do through this remote way as well. So not only in our consumer patterns, but we're seeing the way we work in the future continue to shift as well. In order to do that, of course, we had to have a very robust internal business continuity plan that could be easily adjusted and changed and tested in a very quick environment across the globe. So we've done that. From some operational processes, we also changed the way we onboard our agents. Our agents at Western Union provide a variety of channels for us to implement and pay out money transactions, which is important for our consumers to be able to access money in a time where they perhaps rely on it more than ever because they have lost their jobs and they rely on that money. So in order to do that, we've changed our operational processes to a purely online and a digital onboarding process and oversight process, implementing some Zoom techniques and other tools and monitoring and data to monitor them, or something we may traditionally have done in person with those in the past.
Well, and James, I'm assuming this resonates with you and what you're hearing from your financial institution clients around how they're protecting their customers.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously the world today looks very different to what it did 4, 5, 6 months ago. I mean, fundamentally, whether you think about that from a customer perspective or you think about that from an employee perspective, you've got hundreds of millions of people working from home, trying to access services from different devices, networks, and everything else that you've never seen them come in from. So I think the landscape's changed. I think that that's clearly driven fraud. I mean, you're seeing stats and numbers around what's really happening. Back a couple of months ago, we hosted a webinar. We had someone from FinCEN on there, and I think they talked about the fact they'd had 13,000 filings in the first 2 months of COVID related to COVID-related fraud. So, this whole landscape change has created almost nirvana for criminals. I mean, unlike all of us that sit there and go into board presentations to get investment in strategic platforms, criminals don't. They act today, and so they really, they've seen this as a great opportunity. I saw some interesting stats yesterday about the change and what's happening. I think it's very topical for what we're talking about today, which was since the pandemic started, just in the US alone, over 80 million consumers have signed up for new services digitally who hadn't signed up for them before. And what was also interesting with that was 45% of them said that they only intend to continue to interact digitally with those providers, even when this is all over and we go back to what we consider normal. So I thought that was quite interesting because, again, to me, that talks about, a threat landscape and a fraud environment that's permanently changed. This isn't a short-term thing.
Wow. And we're talking about going back to normal, or what that normal will look like. I mean, as we prepare for 2021, how do you expect regulators to roll out measures and guidelines that help customers and these financial institutions in the event of fraud in the future? Will this rollout be global in nature? Do you expect it to be regional in nature? And how strong do you expect the impacts to be?
Yeah, I think from a regulatory standpoint, we will continue to see a focus on consumer protection. There will be a focus on new consumer protection through more of a digital footprint that will have, I think it will be hard to see a global consistent rollout given the way, of course, the world works and the different governments we have. I know that there is, of course, a lot of focus in the EU on some standardization across the rollout as well. But I think you will continue to see some key principles that will be consistent across the globe, right? Consumer protection, protecting data, being able to have choice in that consumer space where they know what's being done with their data and where it's going. And then I think there will be also continued focus in consumer fraud protection and pressure on financial institutions and others to continue to protect their consumers from fraud schemes, right? So we have that here in the US and the EU, and it's continuing to emerge in other places where we have to help identify for our customers where they're being the victim of a scam.
And do we see any benefits or challenges of measures and guidelines that are already in place? Have we seen some things that have really served to help us in this current environment? Or do we see some things that could possibly hinder us in terms of what's already out there that regulators have laid out in terms of guidelines?
From our Western Union standpoint, there's been a significant of good focus that we've had here in the US. So, for example, while COVID-related fraud scams, we've seen a significant increase in the industry. We've actually seen a reduction here in Western Union, partly because of some of the laws that we're facing and that controls we've implemented along with our regulators from our Consumer Protection Finance Bureau and others. We've seen actually a reduction because we have focused on educating our consumers and seeing this as a responsibility that Western Union has to protect their consumers against fraud that they may become victim to. So we've implemented controls, callbacks, and a significant education campaign across different social media platforms. So we've actually seen a reduction of about 16% year over year from the end of January 16 here at Western Union 2020, from 2019, from a year ago. We've seen about a 16% reduction in that consumer-induced fraud, even though we've seen some increases in COVID-19 related fraud scams.
Wow. Well, we'll be opening up to questions from the audience shortly, but meantime, James, could you talk to us about what the future of physical identity verification looks like?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think it's interesting. So if I think about financial institutions today in particular, and the reliance that they put on physical identity documents, I don't see that changing short term. I think they're so important for consumers today in the way that they assert their identity and the way that they use those to get access to services. So I don't think that's going to change quickly. I think it's interesting what we've seen even this week in the US. So there was a bipartisan House bill that was put forward, which was to talk about investments from a federal government level, looking at standard setting around identity, looking at operating frameworks and structural models around identity. But it also looks even to how there might be funding allocated to states as they start to reissue new driving licenses and moving things towards more of a digital format. So I think the trend's going in the right direction, but I think the reliance on physical documents is here for some time yet. And I think that creates a challenge for organizations. And, Bridget's talked about Western Union, but I think if you're an organization that traditionally has relied on people coming into branches, presenting physical documents, checking them, and then onboarding them, and now they're not going into your branches, you've really got to think about the technology that you can use to verify those documents. And I think it's important that financial services players look for the best technology that's out there. The example I would use is the ability to read chips on passports. If you can use that technology you can extract the information, you can check the certificates, you can get a high resolution image, which you compare against the customer. That's far more robust than just scanning a document and taking a scanned copy. So I think it's keeping up with the technology while those documents are out there, and just trying to stay a step or two ahead of the fraudsters.
Okay, great. And some excellent questions from the audience. I just want to dive right in here. One of the questions, could digital identity actually make it easier for criminals to exploit the system? And how can risk be mitigated? So do you have thoughts on that, Bridget?
I think it depends on what they're looking to exploit, right? So from a pure transparency perspective, there's actually increased controls that we can put in place from a traditional cash transaction process, right? So we can follow the money easier. We can see where it originated from and where it's going in the system. And there's some more transparency that we can use to monitor and mitigate that. I think there's naturally some risks in the digital space that criminals can exploit from account takeover type of activity, from digital identity theft that could happen as well, that have to be considered in those monitors, and those controls have to be set up very robustly in the digital space to make sure that those can't be taken over. So it does depend. I think there are certain aspects that criminals can't exploit as well, because we can have more transparency in the system and the process and control it much easier than the origins of cash, for example. But on the flip side, of course, there's always opportunity for increased identity theft and account takeover in the digital space.
So those controls and the transparency that you talked about, paramount, very important there. And James, I want to talk to you about thoughts about blockchain-based identity solutions. Have you seen a lot of these? And if so, have they been pretty successful?
Yeah, I'll talk to that. I think just going back to the last question as well, I mean, I think I could make a case for digital identity being much more vulnerable. I could equally make a case for existing processes to be much more vulnerable. It's really thinking through the implementation. It's looking at the gaps in the process. I think, as Bridget talked about, I think it's taking a multi-layered approach to the controls that you put in your business and thinking about how are you using data within that? How are you using technology? How are you linking up what you think of as anti-money laundering with the way that you think about fraud, with the way that you think about cyber risk? And how do you join those up and make sure that the systems and the technologies that you're using work across that, and that you update, the processes around those? Because you can implement something and not change your process and have a very unintended consequence. So I think it's an interesting debate that I've had with a few customers, in fact, lots of customers. I think where you end up is that a well-implemented digital identity solution is more robust than sort of traditional processes, but it has to be well thought through. Coming back to
work across, I like the systems that work across those.
Coming back to blockchain question, I think blockchain, it's hard to have a conversation around identity and digital identity without blockchain coming up somewhere. I feel like it's coming up less now than it was, 12 to 18 months ago, because I think more and more when I talk to customers, they think about blockchain as a technology platform, but you've got to figure out the use case. Why are you going down that route? What is it you want to do that blockchain enables as it relates to identity? So I think I've seen some interesting use cases. I think a couple that I would call out. One was around, it was a company called AidTech, where they're using blockchain and identity to start to distribute aid to needy individuals and organizations. And they use the blockchain and smart contracts all the way through the sort of supply chain, if you like, of funding through to people getting medical benefits. And blockchain actually works because of the nature of the smart contracts, the way you can establish identity and make sure that it gets to the desired end recipient. So it's a perfect technology for it. I think I've seen sort of institutional concepts around shared KYC and how you could have records that start to build up credibility and trust on the blockchain because you've got multiple parties that are interacting with those identities. I think those kind of models make sense. And to me, blockchain's a logical technology for those. But I don't personally think that you have to have blockchain as the tech solution for digital identity. I think there's lots of things you can do without even looking at blockchain.
So blockchain is good to have, but maybe at this point, not necessary.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the use case. There has to be a use case that requires blockchain. It shouldn't just be assumed that it has to be the technology platform that you use.
Great, great. So what are your thoughts on fingerprint and biotechnology for in-person payments? Do you see that as something that we're seeing an increase in? Do you think that there are some things that firms to take into consideration before rolling those out? James, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think I haven't really thought about it from an in-person payment perspective, and Bridget might have a view on sort of payments and biometrics. When I think about biometrics more broadly and financial crime, I think the use of biometrics around authentication, because that's where it becomes most valuable. You know, if I think about the steps that you go through to create identities for your customers and to onboard them, if you do that process in isolation and you don't somehow use biometrics, you create the account, but do you know it's the same person coming back the next time to transact? That's where, to me, the biometrics come in. If you create the account, you somehow use biometric identifiers, face, fingerprint, whatever's available, bind that with the account, and then use that for ongoing authentication or transaction authentication. That's where the power comes in, because then you really have a good sense that this is the same individual that first opened the account. So I think they're very valuable. And I think using those in the right way is important.
Excellent. Bridget, keen to get your thoughts on this as well.
I agree with you, James. I think that's right. I think the one limitation for a payment and for authenticating a customer on the first instance when they're first joining you is the reliability of the biometric data or the fingerprint, right? So if it's just myself as a company authenticating this person and they've created a fake ID and a fake system, I have nothing on the biometrics to tie them back to any sort of database to ensure that this biometric data is authenticated at the source. So I think that's one limitation. I very much agree that once you've established the identity of that person, from an ongoing authentication of the person ongoing, it's a great tool, right? It's very reliable. It helps us reduce any risk of confusing who somebody else is, especially in a business that's not account-based, that's a transactional-based business such as ours. But of course, you also have to have the customer adoption and the want to be able to provide that data to you. It also comes with those data security risks, right? So making sure you're storing that data in the appropriate way, that it's not stolen and somebody's personal biometric data is stolen as well. So it comes with those additional risks.
I think that's a great point, particularly around verifying biometrics at the first instance. I mean, there's very few countries today where they've made any kind of government. You know, I think Australia's got their facial verification service, which is starting to take off. And I think there's been a very high level of sensitivity around, images, facial images, biometrics, and understandably so, because there is a balance between privacy and protection. But I think the industry working with regulators and working with governments to make, acceptable access to biometric data available is really key, because I think it can protect the financial system.
Agreed.
It's probably ways to do that.
Another great point that both of you all made earlier has to do with the need to integrate and join up platforms so that security can exist across the various systems. And I'm wondering, how much appetite is there to invest in that sort of integration of different systems? I'm assuming that it might be pretty costly, worth it in the end, perhaps, but pretty costly as an initial investment. Are you seeing a lot of that?
Yes. For sure. I mean, so I think, here we are investing significantly in the security of our data and our customer data, right? It's first and foremost. We have strong processes around our cybersecurity tools, and we constantly do simulations looking for that, because protecting our customer data is a reputational risk, is a business risk, both from a cost perspective as well as, losing customers and losing trust, and naturally a regulatory risk as well, right? So if we lose our customers' data, we also have reporting obligations and follow-ups that come with that as well. So I think the investment in making sure your systems are safe and secure to protect that information, which could be proprietary information, customer information, and whatever it may involve, is first and foremost to protecting your business and your consumers.
So in terms of digital identity preventing illegal cross-border money transactions, is that a strong possibility? Are we seeing more instances of this, or is that not really a reliable way to move forward with preventing those cross-border money transactions. James, what are your thoughts there?
So I think it comes back to what we talked about earlier. Number one is, what are you defining as digital identity? Because I think there's lots of things that come into that. Is it the use of data? Is it the use of documentation? Is it the use of biometrics? I think all of those can help to prevent illegal transactions. Illegal is hard to define, but can help to prevent money laundering, can help to prevent fraud, can help to prevent account takeover. So I think, yes, it can help. And I think all of us, Refinitiv on the supplier side, Bridget on the customer side, we're all trying to think about how we use these solutions to, at the end of the day, prevent illicit fund flows in the financial system. I think where I would take it back a step is even to the last question, which is, if countries start to have standards around digital identities and governments start to work more with the industry and adopt consistent standards, I think that makes it easier for international financial players to start to use identity in a multi-market, multi-regional sense. And ultimately, that's definitely going to help with stopping illicit cross-border flows in particular.
And Bridget, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think from the perspective of, again, having transparency and reliable information that this is the person who we say they are, it can help in the identification of illegal cross-border money transactions. I don't think it's the one issue that would prevent all illegal transactions from occurring, right? So criminal activity is criminals are naturally finding a way to send money around the world, and they're finding ways to do that. So it's an important step to have reliable verification information of who somebody is, but it can't be the one item that would replace transaction monitoring and detection of certain typologies of illegal activity, as well as partnering with, governments, financial intelligence units, law enforcement on searching those criminals. It can help, of course, in identifying those people in the transactions, and that's who they are, and getting that information faster.
So great information here. We're expecting to see increased guidelines and regulations, but they'll be regional in nature as opposed to being global. And that will definitely consist of consumer protection, protecting data, and really more focus on consumer fraud protection overall. Our thoughts there. Education campaigns to reduce fraud, that's a great way to go about really raising awareness to help consumers to protect themselves, as well as to really integrate knowledge there. Also, governments are showing us that there's a possibility of allocating funding to move all things or lots of pieces to digital formats to really assist with this process. And digital identity is only one piece of it, but really building platforms that work across systems, across fraud, across cybersecurity could be a way for firms to continue to make sure that data is protected and to really plan for the future, building for it now and planning for the future. Bridget, James, great information. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Keesa.
Great. And we want to thank everyone for participating in today's live stream. And if you enjoyed today's, then there is a recent expert talk from James Mirfin that you are sure to love. To get more information, type the address you see on your screen or scan the QR code also being shown on your screen now. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and have a fantastic day. Be well.